Hey everybody, and welcome back. It's been a minute, and I'm so happy that I got a chance to record this specific episode because this one's going to be a really eye-opening one. And in this episode, we're going to dive into the concept of success, and we're going to be able to identify what real success is versus what success appears to be. And this is an interesting one because it took a few experiences for myself to realize what the difference really is. And so I'm going to share what success means to me, and I'm actually going to talk about some of the experiences that helped me shape this definition. So let's get started. How many of you have heard the statement that failure is not the opposite of success, but it's actually a part of success? I've heard that statement multiple times, and I can tell you that once I weighed it against some of my own experiences, I realized that that statement actually barely scratches the surface, because success is a lot more than the failures that you've endured. To me, success is more about the character you develop along the way, and it's about the way that you treat other people. And do you know what else I realized? I realized that although some people may seem successful because of the job title they have, the amount of wealth they possess, or even the way they dress, I realized that these factors actually should be avoided when considering if a person is successful or not. And you know how people always say that successful people really like to help other people out who are trying to become successful as well? Well, what I did was I weighed that statement against some of the criteria, and I realized that there's actually no correlation at all. I've had people who are super supportive of me that also met the criteria of, like, a great job title, they dress professionally, and they're wealthy. And I've also had people with the same criteria who have been at the very opposite side of the spectrum. Think about it. Have these two always correlated for you? And you might be wondering, well, if these aren't markers of success, then what are? Before we actually get there, let me tell you about some of the experiences that helped me realize otherwise. Believe it or not, this experience I'm going to talk about is about the communication that I had between the finance professor, who's also a co-director of a program, and somebody who's considered an expert in his field, somebody who definitely people would look up to. So when I was on call with this professor pitching my podcast to him, he expresses that he would be interested in having some sort of equity in the podcast, right? And I expressed that I would actually be interested in a sponsorship model rather than somebody owning any portion of my podcast. And guess what he says to that? He says, well, if you're not helping us, we're not helping you. Furiously, he says that. And my question to you is, does this sound like something a successful person would say? No, right? And it's so funny because you'd think that he would act a little bit differently considering all his personal accomplishments. So now you might be wondering, well, how am I supposed to be able to tell the difference between a truly successful person and, in this case, just a simply privileged person? And you might also want to know, what are some of the red flags that can help me distinguish? So let's get into it. One thing you can consider is, how does the person communicate with you? Are they respectful? Are they tolerant? Are they empathetic? In this case, this guy acted like a 5-year-old kid who didn't get his favorite ice cream flavor for dessert, right? Showing that he's actually just privileged. He hasn't faced any sort of adversity or failures in his life, and it's very clear that he feels like he's entitled to everything that he wants. How else can we tell that he's rather privileged than successful? The fact that he reacted emotionally, the lack of maturity, the fact that he was considering like a transactional or very conditional gain over building and maintaining long-term professional relationships. Not only that, but as a professor, you think that he would provide more support and guidance towards a student who's trying to become successful, but instead you could see that he was highly confrontational and coercive, right? So what does that show? That shows that even his professor title was a result of privilege, not merit. So what would a successful person do? Well, luckily I've had the opportunity to meet with multiple successful professors, and I could tell you that they would be a lot more mature about this situation, regardless of whether they had the capacity to support me or not. So really you can see that the moral of the story in this case is that just because multiple people have the same job title doesn't mean that they're all successful. Because true success is a reflection of character and the way you treat other people. And here's actually another experience that really helped to shape my definition of success. And I actually talk about this in one of my previous episodes briefly. But remember when there was a professor who was constantly criticizing the way I communicate and he was telling me how I'm unable to communicate? Well, that wasn't only a lack of constructive criticism, but he actually did it with the intention to get me to not want to host the podcast anymore and surrender the entire podcast to them. And you might be wondering, well, how does this have anything to do with success, right? Well, I want you to think about the last time somebody said something bad about you and ask yourself, who was that person? Or actually, you can even think about a time that you wanted to start like a project, a business, or perhaps you're training for an athletic event. Ask yourself how many times your coach or your mentor decided to tell you that you suck versus somebody on the sidelines who doesn't really know what it takes to do what you're doing. My point being that successful people who have been through what you actually went through would know that you're going to face struggles because they've been through the same struggles, and they would have the capacity to empathize with you and support you on your journey. They wouldn't really be the ones to put you down. Not only that, but as I thought about his intentions behind his actions, despite somebody who had a supposedly good job, here's what else I realized that you could use to distinguish between a successful and an unsuccessful person. I realized that success is actually defined by how many people trust you. Because with trust, you have the ability to make greater change in this world. But if nobody trusts you, then you're basically like a tree fallen in the woods with not a soul around to hear it, right? So what I'm trying to say is that personal accomplishments actually have little to do with success. Success is also about the impact that you have on other people. And these co-directors, they clearly failed to see that, right? They were so caught up in wanting their own personal achievements and wanting equity in this podcast that they broke trust. And they didn't realize that trust is what gives accomplishments a meaningful significance. If we were just to zoom out and look at the bigger picture here, we can see that they wanted equity in this podcast because they were looking for some sort of a monetary gain, some sort of recognition, some sort of credit for something that they really felt entitled to, right? And this actually brings me to one of my final realizations of success. And this is that people who are successful don't actually chase monetary gains or they don't chase recognition. They're actually trying to fulfill a purpose. And this leads me to my final definition of success. And that is that material gains are simply a byproduct of success. But true success, that's a result of purpose, character, and trust. Before we take off here, ask yourself, who do you want to be? Do you want to be somebody who just appears to be successful? Or do you have it in you to walk the path of true success? With that said, I'll see you next time.
This program is meant for entertainment purposes only. It is not meant to replace any educational programs or represent a professional coaching program. All examples provided by the author and speaker are purely anecdotal and are not meant to represent any institutions or companies in affiliation with the creator.